started. Again, thank you for coming. My name is Shirley Hendricks. I'll do the opening remarks. On behalf of Commissioners Malini Daniel, Elaine Reese, and Arthur Rice, another Commissioner Angela Cabrera will be joining us shortly. Welcome to the Equal Employment Practices Commission's 2018 conference entitled Commitment to Achieving Equality, Exploring Occupational Segregation. As many of you may know, the EPC is an independent non-mayoral agency authorized by the New York City Charter to audit, evaluate, and monitor the employment practices, programs, and procedures of city agencies to ensure that they maintain effective equal employment opportunity for employees of and applicants to New York City government. One of the goals of an Equal Employment Opportunity, or EEO program, is to minimize the barriers that individuals may face when seeking to obtain and maintain employment that suits their knowledge, skills, and experience. Barriers to employment opportunities may be overt, such as discriminatory hiring practices, but they are often more subtle, such as limitations created by word-of-mouth recruitment practices. Some barriers to employment may even be invisible to those who are most challenged by them. EEO barriers have significant impact because they are restrictive not only to employees and applicants, but also to agencies by limiting their ability to access, retain, and promote the best possible candidates for city service. One specific EEO barrier, which is the focus of today's discussion, is occupational segregation. Occupational segregation is the slotting of primarily race or gender-based groups into particular occupations. Today, the EPC seeks to discover how people are steered towards or restricted from holding certain occupations. Occupational segregation can have a detrimental impact not only to individuals' income and stability, but also on organizational outcomes, as the people who could perform well in certain titles may be barred from them. In an ideal workforce, all people would have access to the jobs and opportunities that best suit their qualifications. Measuring occupational segregation helps us to identify how far we are from that ideal so that we can work towards solutions to attaining it. To help us explore occupational segregation and its impact, we are joined today by three experts who will share their experience and expertise on this topic. Dr. Donald Tomaskovich from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Dr. Chandra Childers from the Institute of Women's Policy Research, and Dr. Kim Whedon from Cornell University. Dr. Tomaskovich Devi will speak about segregation and employment equity. Dr. Childers will discuss occupational segregation and the gender wage gap in New York State. And Dr. Whedon will explore whether employment practices can reduce gender segregation. In addition, Dr. Patrick Boyle from the EPC's research unit will provide us with data and insight regarding occupational segregation in the City of New York's workforce. The purpose of this conference is to create an open dialogue and spread awareness about significant but often overlooked barriers to employment opportunities and a contributor to the gender and race differential. As EEO professionals, human resources, agency personnel officers, and union leaders, you are valuable and influential members of a community that has the responsibility of championing equality within the city's workforce. We hope this event serves as a stepping stone to help us recognize and eliminate EEO barriers and to further our collective mission in providing equal employment opportunity for current as well as future city employees. And now, I introduce to you EEO Research Specialist, Fatima Dunat, from the EPC's Research Unit, who will introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to introduce Dr. Tomaskovich Davi. He studies the processes that generate workplace inequality. He is the founding director of the University of Massachusetts Center for Employment Equity and the coordinator of the Comparative Organizational Inequality Network. He has done projects on the impact of financialization upon U.S. income distribution, workplace desegregation, and equal opportunity, network models of labor market structure, and relational inequality. His long-term agenda is to work with others to move the social sciences of inequality to a more fully relational and organizational stance. He is advancing this agenda through empirical studies of jobs and workplaces, as well as social relationships between jobs within workplaces and the social relationships that link organizations to each other. He is best known for his contributions to the relational inequality theory, as well as organizational sampling and measurement methods. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Tomaskovich Davi. And I would ask that during his presentation, please hold questions till the end. We have a section reserved for questions and comments. Thank you. Dr. Davi.
Thank you so much for that overly complex introduction. And I'm not going to cover any of that stuff, or not very much of it. And thank you all for coming out this morning. Thanks to the commissioners and for the staff members of the commission for the invitation. It's really quite an honor to be here. Let's see here. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. So not all of that stuff that I've done, some of which is a while ago at this moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about segregation just as an introduction to the day. I'm going to give you a history of desegregation in the United States. You guys have hard jobs, and then when you come to a meeting like this, and the commission asks you, okay, I want you to start thinking about this so that you can change things faster. It's good to take a historical perspective. These things do change, but they change slowly, and they don't change automatically. It takes some pressure from all of us. Right? Then I'm going to, at the end, I'll give you some examples from the federal government of how you might think about things in your own agency. So I'll give you a little bit of data. Not about New York City agencies, but federal agencies. That way you can say, oh my goodness, how could they be so bad? It's not us. And I'll actually show you some really good agencies too. You can say, oh, that's my agency. Right? And then I'm going to say a little bit at the end about buy-in and leadership and practices. So I think we'll leave most of that till later. A little bit of apologies. The talk, partly because it's historical, partly because this is the kind of data that's out there. I'm going to mostly talk about issues around gender and race, and most of the conversation about race is just going to be in a kind of a black-white frame. That's partly because I'm going to start with the Civil Rights Act. So I'm not going to talk about other kind of ethnic and racial distinctions, which are really important in the United States right now, nor things like disability, age, and the like, which are also important and clearly issues that you're dealing with. So those my apologies for what I'm not going to talk about. So the idea of job segregation or occupational segregation is our kind of topic today. I'm pretty sure you already can think about this and have thought about this in terms of things like neighborhoods or schools, right? And segregation is kind of a powerful mechanism for both enforcing difference and creating inequality. And this is true whether we're thinking about it at the neighborhood level or the school level or the workplace level. So just sort of want you to think about that kind of in the background. When we're talking about actually in terms of workplaces, the first thing, at least for me that's important, is pay is attached to jobs. Right? Some jobs pay better than others. Some jobs have wider pay scales that people can change their earnings over time. And so segregation becomes a mechanism of access to better paying jobs or worse paying jobs. And then there's also kind of career dimension to this, because segregation can also put you on job ladders where you can gain new skills or not, or have access to kind of power over yourself, your everyday life, or over others. Right? Sometimes segregation becomes self-reinforcing, where a job becomes associated with a particular race or gender, and then that changes the status of the job, the way people evaluate not just the people in the job, but the job itself. So segregation can actually change the way you think about the workplaces, the work that people are doing. And then the mechanism has these kind of follow-on effects, right? If you're stuck in a job that's both low wage or low power or does not have much respect, then that can generate turnover in the system. Then the result, the reverse can happen as well. People in attractive jobs look more attractive, right? And then they get promoted quicker, right? And the part of it is, we like to think that when we interact with other people, we're interacting with them as people. But we also use these kind of status markers from work to say, this person is smart or handsome or taller than we think they are because they're in a better job, right? And then there's these, obviously, these key issues of whether or not people are treated with dignity and respect. So I'm going to do a little history now. In '64, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. This happens as a result of political pressure. Right? So the Civil Rights Act is following on in the civil rights movement. Right? And so there's a number of things I want to just make clear here, so that the legal system that we have now was a product of that struggle. And I know you all know this intellectually, but I want to also point out that this continues to be the case, that when we see changes in segregation, they just don't happen naturally. There's always some pressure somewhere. So what's important about the Civil Rights Act, at least for us today right here, it did lots of things around changing the law and people's expectations around gender and race. But for employment, Title VII said that it was illegal to discriminate and to segregate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Just so that you know, many of you probably already know this story, sex was added at the last minute in order to derail the legislation. Nobody thought sex should be treated seriously as a protected category, or very few people in 1964. It didn't do that, and of course there's lots of follow-ons as a result. Most of the time in kind of the legal world that's post Civil Rights Act, we focus on this word discriminate, right? Which is has taken on a certain kind of meaning, legal meaning in the courts, and it's a really hard thing to establish. Segregation, however, is a really easy thing to establish. We can count people and see where they are, right? And so if you're thinking about kind of moving your organizations by saying, we've got to stop discrimination. Well, when you say that, you're actually saying, we've got to stop something that's hard to establish often is sort of in a conflictual kind of a frame. But when you're talking about segregation, you can say, I can count this. And I can say, in my organization, where people are and how they're distributed. Right? So one of the things that came out of the Civil Rights Act was, okay, we've got this new law, but nobody knew how to monitor it or what it would mean to say that there was progress. Right? So those things had to be invented. The earliest invention was just, let's look at exclusion. Right? Do you have any women? Do you have any African Americans or other minorities in your workplace? Right? At this point in history, that's a fairly low bar. Right? We're past that in most places. What's that?
There are no women in some industries. I'm one of 10 at Columbia Law School.
Oh, well, okay, so it's, in most of your agencies, that's a lower bar. In some places, it's still an issue. And then pay gaps. Lawyers love pay gaps. I love pay gaps. I love pay gaps because they're really easy to measure too. Lawyers like pay gaps because then it's very easy to figure out what the damages are, and then they know what their share of the deal is. But today we're talking about kind of segregation, and I'm not going to give you lots of measurement or anything like that, but the key issue when we have measures of segregation is how differently distributed are groups across some set of units, neighborhoods, schools, job titles in your agencies. And Dr. Boyle, later on, will talk about segregation across New York City job titles. There we go. It's one of the things that's good about segregation. It's not like discrimination. In discrimination, lawyers want to ask that question, yes or no, did this happen? Right? Very hard question to answer. Here the question is how much and what are the trends? Right? Are things getting better or are they getting worse? So it's tractable. There's a classic measure, the index of dissimilarity, which I know I'm going to use here, and Dr. Boyle uses as well. You'll see more of it. The index of dissimilarity is, you won't get a calculation from me. It's a nice simple number. It goes from 0, there's no segregation, to 100, there's complete segregation. With complete segregation, that means women and men never work in the same jobs in these workplaces, right? What's great about it as a number is if it's 55, it means 55% of the smaller group would have to switch jobs. It actually even tells you how much work needs to be done. Okay. But I think it's also important to think about this in terms of the quality of jobs. The segregation measure doesn't tell you if it's a good job or a bad job, it just tells you about the difference. And in a little while, I'm going to show you some agencies in the federal government where women out-earn men on average. And part of it is because they're segregated into better jobs. Okay. So now we're going to go, if we go back to 66, so 100 is the maximum, right? What we see is gender segregation. This is private sector data collected by the EEOC, the federal agency. If we go back to 66, segregation on gender basis is almost perfect. That is, men and women don't work together in the same occupations. And race segregation is very, very high. The EEOC actually doesn't collect data on job titles. These are like managers versus professionals. So when I look at these data, I think, if we go back to 66, men and women, blacks and whites, never or almost never work in the same job in the same workplace. Right? And then if we look at good jobs, managerial, professional, or craft jobs, relative to the supply of labor, what we find is white men were overrepresented in all of these jobs. The other groups were very underrepresented. The only kind of interesting thing here is black men were in some skilled trades. People in the North like to pat themselves on the back, but this was largely a phenomenon of the South, not of the North, where African Americans were a more important part of the, more included part of the working class prior to the Civil Rights Act. So this is where we're starting out historically. And if you think about social change, then what I want you to think is we saw Martin Luther King in that picture with Johnson before, right? The civil rights movement is a pressure to create the Civil Rights Act And if we look over time at change, change happens fastest when there's pressure, right? And if there's pressure outside of your organization, which is often an irritating thing for your bosses especially, it will then often generate pressure inside of your organizations. There are some things that if we go back in time, we can say, oh, okay, here's the kinds of things that led to segregation as a kind of nearly total thing back in the day, prior to the Civil Rights Act. But a lot of these things are still here, but in some ways we've become more subtle. It's about, once you start having integrated workplaces, right, then there comes to be, it's not complete exclusion, it's complete support, complete segregation. Now the devil is increasingly in the details, right? Who gets access to training? Who has the kind of internal networks that help you get promoted and the like? So things are more subtle. And even at the level of individuals, we often have not so much, not saying that this is excluded anymore, explicit prejudice kinds of things, but we also have kinds of the simpler kinds of inclusionary biases, right? So to exclude somebody on the basis of their race or gender seems like a bad thing these days. But to get a job for my nephew, no, not so much. Right? Okay. So now if we look over the long term, this is from 66 to 2005, these data, those numbers get better. You see there's this kind of downward trend in segregation levels. And in fact, by the end of this period, the segregation of white women from white men and black men from white men is in the mid-50s, down from almost 100, right? You're going to see when Dr. Boyle does his presentation later today. That's about the level of gender and race segregation in New York City right now. Right? So New York City doesn't look that far off from the national, where the national trends happen. The thing I wanted to outline here, however, is this political process. Most of the progress for African Americans in the United States stopped in 1980. Right? And it stopped at about the same time that the political pressures for social change stopped. Right? You can see for white women there's continued progress, but even that sort of slows down in the 90s and then stops afterwards. Right? So if we take it as a long-term historical kind of a process, the political pressure in the society on workplaces to adjust their practices are important. Right? Doesn't mean the story always looks like this. There are some like bright spots. Professional jobs that require some type of college certification have tended to improve even more recently. Right? And that's partly because colleges have done a better job than workplaces at integrating access to jobs. And so, for example, all of your agencies, when you hire accountants, they have accounting degrees. And the colleges are putting out a much more diverse group of people with accounting degrees. So there are clearly the inputs matter, right? So those data were all about the private sector, and I actually don't have comparable data about the public sector. So that's probably one of the things I should have apologized at the beginning, but I'll try to make up for it in a moment. But we do know some things about the public sector. So first, by the 1980s, the public sector looked better than the private sector. Right? The political pressures and the political will in the public sector to advance equality agendas, to desegregate workplaces, were strong. And so in the 1980s, we had lower pay, promotion, firing, race and gender disparities in the public sector. Didn't have good workplace data, so I can't tell you whether that's true about New York City versus Atlanta or versus the feds. But there's been some disturbing changes in managerial practices in the public sector, and I can't say if this is true for New York or not, but it's true in many places across the country, where the public sector has increasingly tried to look more like the private sector. You can see this in kind of outsourcing practices, where whole classes of jobs disappear from the public sector and are moved to the private sector. And then you can also see this kind of increased managerial discretion in hiring and pay setting. Okay? These things have been clearly tied to rising racial inequality in the public sector. Again, the research on this is not looking yet at particular workplaces in the public sector, so I can't tell you if this is true in New York versus Atlanta versus somewhere else. It's actually, I can tell you that both race and gender inequality in the federal government have continued to decline. So that means the research that's out there that shows rising racial inequality in the public sector is telling us something about state and local government, not the federal government. Okay, so some of the data that I've given you so far, what I just said about the public sector, is kind of these big national trends, right? But obviously, all of these processes are local, right? That is, your jobs and your agencies is to figure out how to hire people, figure out how to deal with their discontents, manage tensions between people on the job, as well as the topic for today, which is can we promote an equality agenda over time? Hard jobs, I understand that. Glad they're your jobs, not mine. And we all need to be employed. But in that sense, these kinds of, all of the kind of micro level processes that generate this segregation, including the political pressures for change, they're all local, right? And whenever we see some national trend or a city trend, there's a kind of a firm level process. Now, I use the word firm because that's what scholars tend to do, but I should be using the word agencies, right? It's an agency level process. And one of the things now that's important is that there's lots of organizational variation. I'm going to sort of getting towards the end of my comments here. And so when we look at national trends, for example, you see this kind of plateauing of racial inequality in the private sector. That doesn't mean every workplace is plateaued. Right? If you see a flat line, it means some workplaces are getting better and some are getting worse. And then the interesting kind of question at the organizational level is which ones and why. So if, for example, New York City looks like the national trends, it probably means there are some agencies that are doing better over time and some that are doing worse over time. So now, okay, that's the kind of threatening statement. But I don't have the data on your agencies, but I do on some federal agencies. So that also means that others are probably not doing well. But let's look at the feds. So, okay, this is the fanciest piece of data here. This is the distribution of 481 federal agencies in 1994 and 2000. Any agency that is a 1, men and women make the same or have the same earnings in that agency. Anything to the left of the 1, men are out earning women. Anything to the right, women are out. Sorry, got a little out of control there. Women are out earning men, right? Now what you see here is in 1994, women are making about, in the federal government, about 90% of what men make. And it goes up. Now it's probably around 96%. That is the average, right? But there's also a spread, right? So there are some federal agencies way down here where women are only making about 75% of what men are making, right? Those disappear by 2008, and now there are some federal agencies where they're making maybe 18% less than men. But the interesting thing, and I think in some ways the heartening thing, if one starts to think this way, is there are also agencies over here. Right? Okay, so now, so that's sort of historical data. I'm going to now have a little bit, I'm going to give you the 10 worst agencies in the federal government for the gender wage gaps. Right? Almost all of them are in the armed forces. The exception is the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and this is 2014. The orange bars is the gender wage gap adjusted for education and tenure and experience, kind of the first cut on like-to-like comparisons. And then the green bar is what proportion of this gap between here and here is produced by segregation. All right? And what you'll see is most of the gap, over 90% in every one of these cases, is produced by men and women being in different job titles in these agencies. Right? So what does that mean? It means if you're in the Air Force and you're the commander, the general, I don't know what it's called, of the Pacific Air Force crew, right? You say, oh, the problem here is not so much that men and women in the same job are being treated differently, but they're just in different jobs. Right? Now it becomes a question of hiring and promotion and turnover. Right? Now, on the other hand, there are a set of agencies in the federal government where, after you've controlled for education and the like, women are out earning men. In the National Gallery of Art, it's actually 18% female advantage. Again, however, segregation explains it. And you see almost all, wherever we find women's advantage, almost all of it is a function of segregation between jobs. That is, women are in better jobs than men. Now, in an equal opportunity society, you'd expect this. There's some kind of random sorting patterns. There's some types of histories of particular agencies. And what you'd expect is, in an equal opportunity society, you'd expect these distributions to move to the right, so they were averaging at 1. There'd be some places which, for some historical reasons, women did a little bit better than men, and there'd be some places, for historical reasons, where men did a little bit better than women. 10 minutes, that's great. Okay, so now what about New York City? Right, if I had this slide, well, I've ruined the day probably. So I don't have this slide, right? But it does suggest that in your agencies, there are probably some that look like the Air Force, right? And some that look like this group. Probably not the General Counsel's office though, right?
It depends on the agency.
Yeah. So that's actually mostly the end of my comments. There's a lot, there's also good research, and I know Dr. Whedon's going to talk about it, and maybe later on in the Q&A about this. But there's also research about saying, well, what kind of internal things matter, right? A lot of people talk about leadership. You can think for your jobs when you're pressuring the heads of your agencies and they're saying, not today, I don't have time for a meeting, that these are issues that one has to get passed. But the others are organizations count and pay attention to stuff they care about. Right? And so one of the things that I think that's possible here is that you can develop metrics for your organization. Obviously, it helps if you have the wind at your back, and there's also pressure from outside. A few years ago, I made this proposal to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I said, every year you collect data from people, from these firms, and you never give them anything back. Why don't you send them a report card? Right? Why don't you do a yearly report card to firms. They didn't pick me up on the idea, but there it is. Still selling it. So thank you very much. I'm not the boss here. Am I taking questions?
Yes.
Yes.
On your chart that had women earning as much in museums and even in law, my question is relatively simple, particularly after seeing RPG and listening to Ruth saying that if you went to Cornell, it was 4-1 and you didn't come home with a husband, you were a failure. So is there a hangover of a presumption of what are female jobs and therefore appropriate still within the federal government for what's right for females? And there aren't a whole lot of generals in the Army that are females. There aren't a whole lot of women in the Army still today who have, if you will, war experience or battlefront experience. The Marines just had a whole tumult about whether it was appropriate to put a woman at the front or not, or in a group that could go to the front. And so is there still a social hangover, for want of a better term, of what's appropriate for females? We should be home having babies and cooking, and at best we can probably write applications for museums, but please don't have us run anything.
I like that phrase, social hangover. It actually reminds me of some hearing yesterday.
Please don't go there, I'm still fuming.
So, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Certainly, so one of the things that we know about kind of the desegregation of particular occupations is that women are much more likely to move into male occupations than men to move into female occupations. So if there's a hangover here, men are they have a bigger headache. I think there's another issue though that's kind of thinking generational, right? And so the people at the top of organizations do tend to be older, right? On the other hand, the Civil Rights Act is 50, whatever that is, 4 years ago, right? So for most organizations, it's 2 cohorts of careers. So we do tend to see the higher end organizations, the more male and the more white they are. And some of that is the product of what was the pipeline 20 and 30 years ago, for sure. Right? On the other hand, that puts us back in 1980.
The numbers at the law schools are still not in.
Right, no, that's true.
That's the one area I know about.
Right. So, I mean, the professions are pretty interesting. I had that nice chart on professions, right? There are some professions that have not integrated as quickly as others. At this point, the law is pretty gender equal. Medicine is, accounting is, some sciences is right. Architecture is not, engineering is not. On our campuses, our economics departments and our philosophy departments are like, they could be in the 19th century. Yeah. So it is unequal across different, really quite specific skill sets. Anyone else? I'm a nice professor. I never make fun of people. Unless they ask silly questions. All right. Yeah, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daffy. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Chandra Childers. She is a senior research scientist at the Institute of Women's Policy Research, and it's an organization that conducts and communicates research to inspire dialogue, shape policy, and improve the lives and opportunities of women of diverse backgrounds, circumstances, and experiences. She's an expert on social stratification and social and economic inequality by race and sex. Dr. Chandra examines issues related to women and girls of color and job equality. So please join us in welcome Dr. Childs. And once again, if you can hold questions for the end.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for inviting me and for having me. And what I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk about the gender wage gap, and I want to talk about occupational segregation and its role in the gender wage gap. A lot of the data and research that I will be talking to you about today is research that draws from our Status of Women in the States project. And so we have, beginning in 1996, put out a report that looks at state-level data across a range of areas. Political participation, employment and earnings, work and family, poverty and opportunity, reproductive rights, health and well-being, and violence and safety. And we've updated this several times. The latest for the full report that we published was in 2015. But on our website, we have updated the data, and we've also put out fact sheets for different states. And so a lot of what I will be presenting today will draw from some of the research that we have put out for New York State. So let me start talking about the gender wage gap. And here, what I've got is earnings for men and women, median earnings for men and women in the state of New York. So this is for New York State, the state as a whole, and for the United States. And a couple of things that stand out here is one, men and women in New York State have higher median earnings than nationally. But also what stands out here, well, it may not be as clear, but the gender wage gap in New York State is smaller than the wage gap nationally. So women in New York State earn 90 cents for every dollar that a man in New York State earns, whereas nationally women earn only 80 cents for every dollar that a man earns. And we have wide variation across the states. And one of the reasons we produce this data for states is we want states to be able to compare themselves to each other, see where they stand relative to the national level, but also to other states. But we also want states to be able to track where they are and whether or not they're improving. So we want this data to be available so people can actually put it to use so that it can inform policy making and it can inform interventions from foundations and other interested parties. So here, I want to start out just looking at women and men. And then I want to point out that even if we break this down by race and ethnicity, which we generally try always to do, to look at differences for different racial and ethnic groups, we find that women that earn less than men in each and every racial and ethnic group. So African American women earn less than African American men. Hispanic women earn less than Hispanic men. White women earn less than white men. So we see this across racial and ethnic groups, and that points to the role of gender in shaping the earnings that people take home when we look at this across groups. But one way to begin to look at this, to get a clear sense of how gender and race interact, is not comparing women and men of the same race and ethnicity, but to compare the earnings of women by race and ethnicity with white men, the largest group in the labor market. So what I have here is the share of white men's earnings earned by women from different racial and ethnic groups. So here we can see that in New York State, and again this is specific to New York State, white women earn 81 cents for every dollar that white men earn. Asian women earn 83%. But when we look at Hispanic women, you see that they earn only 56 cents for every dollar that white men earn. And this is for full-time year-round employees. This is limited to full-time year-round workers. Native American women, Black women have really relatively low earnings compared to the earnings of white men. And so here we can see this is how race and gender both interact, or intersectional approach to understanding what's happening with earnings. Now, there have been put forward a number of different explanations for why women earn less than men. And a couple of those explanations include labor market experience and education. And here what I have is looking at trends in labor market participation for women and men going back to 1950. And as you can see, there's a clear movement of women into the labor market. Again, women don't make it to the same level of labor market participation that men have. But we see that over the 1960s and 1970s, the trend, there's really a quick uptick in the movement of women into the labor market. And so we might think that over that period of time, when women are really moving into the labor market in large numbers, that we might have seen that gender wage gap dropping during that same period of time. But if I don't have the chart, but if we were looking at trends in the gender wage gap, we would find that over that period, that wage gap was not closing, even as women were moving into the labor market in larger numbers. So in 1960, for example, women earned 60 cents for every dollar that men earned, which gave us a wage gap of 40%. It remained at about 40% over the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't until the 1980s that we began to see the wage gap close. And during that period, we do still have women moving into the labor market, but it's at a slower rate. And if we look at the actual cause of the closing of that gender wage gap, it's as much men's earnings declining or stagnating during that period as women's earnings rising. So women's earnings did rise relative to men, because men stagnated. That accounted for a lot of that closing of the wage gap. And since about the 1990s, that wage gap has moved very little. So we're not seeing a lot of continued change, even as women are moving into the labor market in larger numbers. And that's not to say that women still have the same labor market experience as men, because women are still more likely to take time out of the labor market because family responsibilities fall disproportionately on women. And there's one thing I would like to say as well. Often when we talk about the gender wage gap, that number that I'm talking about, that's just comparing the median earnings of all men and all women working full-time year-round. And when people point to explanations for the gender wage gap or things that explain the gender wage gap, like women taking more time out of the labor market, I would view that more as saying it's pointing to other issues, other questions that we need to answer to begin to address that gender wage gap. It's not an explanation to say women have to take more time out of the labor market. What it is pointing to the fact that we need to make it easier for women to balance work and family demands so that they don't have to take that time out, or so that they're not punished for needing that time out. And here I just want to show labor market participation, again broken down by race and ethnicity. So we can see, again, there are differences in labor market participation rates. Multiracial women have the highest labor market participation rate, followed by Black women or African American women, and followed closely in third by white women. Another explanation that has generally been put forward for the gender wage gap is educational differences. So here we can see trends in education for women in the 1970s. And one thing that's really clear that we can see, that the share of women with less than a high school education has declined, and the share of women who have a four-year college degree or more has grown dramatically. Beginning in the 1990s, women became more likely than men to have a bachelor's degree. And today, women are more likely than men to have a post-secondary degree. So women are actually more educated, more likely to have an advanced degree than are men. And when we look at women by race and ethnicity, we can also see, for example, that Black women are more likely to have a bachelor's degree than Black men. Yet again, Black men still have higher earnings. White women and white men still have higher earnings than white women. And so this is one of the reasons I point out that these are not factors that are going to explain that gender wage gap. However, a major factor, as Dr. Tomasko-McDeevy has pointed out, is occupational segregation, or he was talking about job segregation. But segregation in occupations and industries account for the majority of the gender wage gap. It counts for over half of it. And the process is really kind of interesting in looking at the way occupational segregation works. Men and women tend to work in different occupations. But it's not just that they work in different occupations, it's that women tend to work in worse occupations. Occupations that have lower pay, occupations that provide less autonomy, occupations that provide less flexibility, fewer benefits, that we would associate with good jobs or with good occupations. And so women become concentrated in jobs. One, many of these jobs are jobs where women are doing work that they've traditionally done in the home without pay. So if you think about child care workers, you think about home health aides, you think about nursing aides, you think about, did I say child care workers? Yeah, okay. You think about these jobs, this is work that women have traditionally done in the home without pay. These are also really low paying occupations. And they're jobs predominantly done by women. I believe child care workers is like, it's over 80% women. It's an over 80% female occupation. Home health aides, those are predominantly female jobs. You think about elementary school teachers, again, jobs predominantly done by women. And so these jobs become devalued because they are associated with work that has traditionally been done by women, and they also continue to be filled predominantly by women workers. And so here I want to take a little closer look at segregation in a couple of ways. So the first way is looking at segregation across occupations. So if we take the 20 most common occupations, or the 20 occupations that employ the largest numbers of women and the 20 occupations that employ the largest numbers of men, we can see how segregated workers really are. So in that 20 occupations for women, more than 4 in 10 women work in just those 20 occupations. And this is out of more than 500 occupations. Just 20 employ more than 4 in 10 women. And 10 of those are female dominated, which means 75% or more of workers in those occupations are women. So again, women work with other women in these occupations. But when we look at the 20 most common occupations for men, fewer are concentrated in those, just 3 in 10 men, but 11 of those are male dominated. So that means 75% or more of workers in those occupations are men. And some of the others are close. But only 4 of those occupations show up in the list of most common occupations for men and women. So that's looking across occupations. This chart here I want to highlight. Here we're looking at segregation to some degree across, but really within, and really beginning to understand how segregation works. So, we often hear about, and we use this indicator, what share of women are employed in management occupations. That's one of the indicators we use when we assess states and how well women are doing in states. But again, when we look at management, that's a pretty broad occupation. And so, we can look at, it looks fairly integrated. 39% of management workers are women. So it looks like women are a good part of that occupation. But we've heard about, that even within occupations, women earn less than the men, even in the same occupation. And part of that is because of where women are working within. So women are 39% of management workers, but there are fewer of chief executives, and there are much less of chief executives in Fortune 500 companies. So when we look at the jobs that are the most lucrative, that are going to provide the greatest benefits, that's going to provide the most opportunity for mobility in the future, there are fewer women. And so a lot of these women, they may be in management occupations, not elsewhere, classified, or in other occupations, other occupations that have lower pay, that are not as. So this is part of what's going into understanding women's lower pay, but also the lack of access to other more lucrative occupations because of where they're concentrated. Again, you can look at, for example, women in law. You know, they're less likely to be partners. We can look at women in universities. You know, how likely are they to become tenured in different, especially in high status departments? Another way of looking at this is looking at the most common occupations for women by race and ethnicity. And again, this can really help us begin to see where those wage gaps between women of just different race and ethnicities are coming up. So if we look at, for white women, secretaries and administrative assistants, elementary, middle school teachers, registered nurses, and managers not elsewhere classified. Those are 4 of the 5 most common occupations. Yet when we look at the most common occupations for Hispanic women and for Black women, we see that for Hispanic women, 4 of their 5 occupations, maids and housekeeping cleaners, nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides, cashiers, and child care workers are actually all very low-paying occupations. If I'm not mistaken, these all pay wages of less than $25,000, you know, right at or below $25,000 a year. And again, this is, you know, so this is going to be really, for full-time work, it's less than $25,000 a year for women to raise families and provide. And this is the index of the similarity that Dr. Smaskovic introduced you to a little bit earlier. And again, you know, the way of reading that is looking at the percent of workers who would need to switch to an occupation in which they were underrepresented for both groups of workers to have the same distribution. And so what I've done is I've done a comparison of white and Hispanic women, white and Black women, and white and Asian Pacific Islander women. And again, this is for 1990, 2000, and 2016. And you can see, one, what stands out that's really striking is that there hasn't been a whole lot of change over a really long period of time. And again, this is for New York State. But what change there is going in the wrong direction. It looks like we're seeing slight upticks in occupational segregation between white women and Hispanic women and white women and Black women, which is an area of concern. And here's that measure again of the share of women in management. And this is, you know, this is one of those indicators that we use to understand how women are doing in a state. Do they have access to management and to professional occupations? Looking at management occupations, we can see again who's most likely to work in those occupations and who is less likely to have access to management occupations. With, again, white women and Asian Pacific Islander women having greater access, and Hispanic women and Black women having the least access of women in New York State to managerial occupations. And now I just kind of want to talk a little bit about why this all really matters and why this is really important. These are occupational projections for New York State for the occupations that are projected to add the largest number of new jobs going forward through 2026. Home health aides is the single job projected, and this is not that different from national numbers. If you look at national numbers, this is happening nationally as well. These are, again, you know, those out of the top 5, only 1, registered nurses, really pay good wages. And we also saw that women and men and women from different racial and ethnic backgrounds are not equally likely to work in each of these occupations, which has implications for inequalities going forward. But it also, you know, for me, what this calls out, one of the things I quite often hear people say is that women want to earn more, they should move into better jobs. The demand for these jobs is not going away. As our population ages, someone is going to have to do these jobs. You know, everyone can't leave these jobs. So it really, you know, begs the question of how we can improve these jobs to make these jobs better jobs. And in the spirit of talking about occupational segregation, you know, desegregating these jobs might be one way that we think more about how to raise the quality of work in these jobs. And so looking at this, it's really important that we think about where our economy is going. And the last couple of things I want to highlight about segregation and the gender wage gap, poverty. One of the things that we know, we have shown, is that if we close the gender wage gap between women and similar men, so that's men who are working the same number of hours with the same level of education, living in the same region, that we could cut the poverty rate for working women in half. And that would also lift millions of children out of poverty as well. So here, these are, our analyses. I am. I'm going to go back. I just wanted to show this real quick, and then I'm going right at you. I wanted to. This graphic to me really kind of makes that point of how much closing that gender wage gap for working women, how important that is. So it would cut the poverty rate in half among working women, and that's really important also because half of women in families with children are breadwinners in their homes. So, and that's not just single mothers, but even among married women, we define breadwinners as women who bring in 40% or more of household income. So even in married couples, women's income are central to the economic well-being of their families. And if we think about this in the long term, lost earnings and security in retirement. Again, we have really started looking at wealth, looking at the wealth gap, looking at economic security into retirement. And if your earnings are $25,000 a year, you're not really going to be able to prepare for a secure retirement. And the more I hear people talking about, Social Security and all the policies that we're hearing people talk about, it becomes even more important. Public assistance as a taxpayer subsidy. Again, quite often, we demonize people who do need to depend on the social safety net. And at some point in time, I would argue that's everybody. At some point, everyone has had to draw on that. But low wages are one of the reasons that, it's low wages that workers have. Many workers who draw on the social safety net, they are workers, they are employed. And that's another reason I like to show that labor force participation slide. Greater economic growth. And again, I'm not going to go into any weeds here, but when we think about the number of students who are graduating with student loan debt, all of that increase in education, that has come with a price tag. And we have people graduating from colleges and universities with enormous amounts of student debt, but low wages, so they're not able to pay that debt off. It means that they're not able to buy homes, buy cars, they're not able, and our economy really is built on the consumption. And so there are consequences for low wages for these workers, and again, the central part of that is occupational segregation. Thank you. Any questions?
Good morning, thank you. My name is Heather. I had a comment and a question. For my comment, I totally agree with you that if you're, especially in New York City, if you're a single parent, a sole breadwinner, your income determines economic security. But say, for example, you're a registered nurse and you're only making $85,000 and you're like you have 3 kids. It's kind of hard to make money, enough money given inflation. In order to get good money, you have to be like an advanced practice nurse, like a nurse practitioner. And sometimes you're limited access to student loans or scholarships that prohibit you from, enhancing your career path. And the second question I had was, I work for a city agency, and one of the challenges we found is that there are more women in managerial positions versus men. So in my agency, there are more women in managerial positions versus men. So one of the things we're trying to do from a recruitment standpoint is try to create formal mentoring programs to promote from within, to increase men's access to career paths, for promotion. Do you have any suggestions beyond just a mentoring program to get leadership buy-in from hiring managers to be willing to give these men a chance? We have a lot of men within the agency, but in terms of accessibility or being able to get an opportunity for managerial positions is very limited. Women dominate managerial positions in our agency, so we're trying to find ways to get buy-in from the hiring managers to give men a chance who may have comparable educational qualifications versus women. Do you have any other suggestions beyond just the mentoring program? How can we get buy-in from the hiring managers?
Well, and I think our next speaker may be better able to answer that question.
Okay.
But, I think once people can understand what impact those changes will have for them personally, that when they realize the impact that that has for their career, for their well-being, that getting them to understand and see that picture is an important part of that. But I think our next speaker is probably going to be much better able to. And you said that was your second. What was the first question?
No, the first one was just a comment that,
Yeah.
you have to be like an advanced, if in the nursing profession, which is more heavily dominated by women,
Yes.
in order to really get the salary you deserve, you have to be not just a regular bedside nurse, you need to be an advanced practice life, like a nurse practitioner, a midwife, an educator, and it costs money to go to school.
Yes.
And unless you have access to financial resources like a scholarship
Yes.
or loans, sometimes you already have a lot of loans from your undergrad, your BSN, and then you're not even making enough money to pay those off. And in order to get the money you deserve to feed your family and not be living by paycheck to paycheck, you need money to pay for going to be a nurse practitioner. And it's a very limited access to those financial resources.
Yeah, and I think that's another, when we talk about, again, that inequality generally, is that different groups of people have differential access to loans, or having to go into debt in the first place.
Right.
Which is one of the things that reproduces intergenerationally that inequality, if it's not addressed. At some point, if it's not dealt with, it just keeps naturally reproducing for that very reason.
Thank you.
Good morning. You mentioned earlier that women are more likely to get advanced degrees when compared to men, and that black women are more likely to get a degree when compared to black men. And I think the answer to my question might be obvious, but I just wanted to know if you had any information or data on women getting an advanced degree or a degree in general in hopes of earning equal to or more than men. You understand?
Whether that's the goal is to.
Yeah, do you have any information or data on that? Or I know it's an obvious answer, like they probably are doing it for that reason, but I just wanted to know if you had any information or data on
Well,
that.
I think that with the women, and we've done some focus groups talking with women, and a lot of it is, I don't know necessarily how much of it is the goal is to get equal earnings to men, but I do know the goal is to earn enough to provide comfortably for their family. They want to do better. They want to set examples for their children, and they want to be able to provide for their children. And I remember in one set of interviews, people talked about they wanted to be able to buy their house, they wanted to be able to take family vacations, and they wanted their children to be, to have a safe neighborhood and a good school. I mean, it really, it was just, listening to just the simplicity of that. It's what we all think of as just being married. She wanted to take vacations. Yeah.
Thank you.
I love that.
Hi, good morning. I was trying to think of my question, but I think based on the last question, what role does community or family play in sort of the next generation of workers coming up? So as a mentor, I'm often conflicted with what advice I give to young people. Meaning, so based on the last question, is the advice, you know what? Get your degree so that when you do go out and work, you're putting yourself at a certain level that they can't deter you from negotiating for a higher salary. Or is it, you know what? You want to start small, take that job that doesn't pay as much, work your way up, and then you can get your degree while you're earning I'm trying to figure out, there's certain things, there's a lot that you mentioned that's very important, but a lot of it starts at how we train our kids to seek those higher earnings. Just any guidance or advice.
No, that's a really hard question because, when you say go get your degree, you're taking on a lot of debt. And depending, one of the things that's, that's not up here is that for especially like African American women in particular, one of the ways they're increasing their access to degrees is through private for-profit colleges, which means they're graduating with a lot of debt. And that's a real issue. That's a real problem. And so even before, a couple of things. One, we need to address access to public, public not-for-profit universities. But there are also some jobs that are, we call them middle skill jobs. They're jobs that tend to pay well and don't require degrees. So I would say the first step is for whoever you're talking to, get information about what their interests are, what jobs are available, what jobs pay, what they actually require for entry. Because, some jobs, me and another young woman in my organization just got promoted. Well, she started out, she didn't come in with a PhD, but she had managed to work her way up. And, so I think it's about educating people, letting them know what the options are. Because I think a lot of times people don't know that certain jobs are an option. They don't know, like my mom, I never could get her to understand what I actually do. And so, so knowing what the options are, knowing what each option requires, and knowing what I think that it has to be kind of a systematic, step by step, and people weigh, for themselves, how much debt am I going to, what's the likelihood that this is going to land me a job? What's the likelihood, there may be some great thing, but if there's 3 jobs in that, or, in the country, so I just think it's education and knowing the full range of options and opportunities. I've been amazed at the options and opportunities that I've seen that I had no idea even existed.
Thank you.
I read some data that the education of a mother will be a prediction on the education, how far their child will go. So the mother's education is a greater impact than an indicator than the father. So do you think you'll be seeing some increase or some trend in the future for generations now that we're seeing mothers having more advanced degrees?
I think to some degree, part of what I'm concerned about, and again, I haven't looked at this closely at the data on this, so some of this is just kind of speculation, but I am aware of like the student loan burden. Even though moms have this higher level of education, there is a great deal of student loan debt that they're being burdened with as well, and that has impacts in a number of ways on their career, on their lives, and I think it does so in a way that makes it more difficult for them to be able to help their own children go to college and obtain a higher education. So I'm not really sure. I think there's a couple of different forces pushing in a number of different ways, and I'm not quite sure where that goes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Challis. And if there was any further question, we have a Q&A question at the end where we can all ask questions of the panel. I would now like to introduce Dr. Kim Whedon. She is the Jan Zubro 77 Professor of the Social Sciences and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Director of the Center for Study of Inequality. Much of her research examines the causes of gender segregation and the gender gap in wages in the United States. She has also been involved in efforts to help universities change their organizational practices in order to increase the recruitment and promotion of women in the sciences and engineering. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reed.
Thanks. While he's getting the slides set up, I should mention, by way of apology, that I'm accustomed to talking in 75-minute blocks to about 250 students, all of whom are about age 20 and much less well-dressed, as you guys are, by the way. I also wanted to just do a little bit of sociology by guesswork. What proportion of people who enter for-profit colleges do you think graduate with a baccalaureate degree? What percentage? 10. Who said 10? Oh, you cheated, Dawn. So, I mean, when we think about for-profit colleges, they're actually the highest growing sector of American higher education, and the graduation rates are currently 9%. So think about that. 9% of people who enter for-profits are actually getting their degrees. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that today, though. I'm going to do something that's a little bit different. I'm going to give you kind of an overview, if you will, of some highlights, a non-representative sample of some of the social science research that's coming out about employment practices today that can affect levels of gender segregation. I want to start, as some of the other speakers have today, I'm probably going third, is that all this is old news by now. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the historical trends in occupational segregation. This is, again, using that famous index of dissimilarity. And essentially, this is for the entire country. And so this is census data for the entire country, not for New York State, and certainly not for the city of New York. But basically, it's showing that in 1950, about 62% of women would have to change jobs into a male-type job in order for there to be equal representation in all jobs. By 2016, it's just below 50%, right? But you can also see uneven trends, right? That the decrease in segregation was much, much more prominent immediately after that civil rights era, the 1970s and 1980s. After 1990, yeah, there's a little bit of a decline, but people are described as being glacially slow change. Probably the glaciers themselves are actually changing more rapidly than segregation is. And I just wanted to, again, do a little bit of interaction here. If gender segregation continued to decline at the same rate that it has since 1990, so roughly 30 years almost ago, how long do you think it will take to reach full integration?
50 years.
50 years. 70. So let's put it this way, we'll all be dead. So, at current rates of change, it takes approximately 330 years for there to be integration in the labor market. Yeah. Which one? That one. 330 years. This is the Twitter moment, right? The rest of the talk is all just boring, but this is the Twitter. This is the 240 character version. 280. So it takes 330 years to integrate the labor market. We also know, as some of the other speakers have alluded to, that segregation is incredibly important for thinking about the gender gap in wages. It explains about 18% of the gender gap in wages. This is after you've adjusted for education, for hours, and for work experience. And this is a little bit, I mean, there's controversy about whether you should be adjusting for these things when you're talking about how much segregation accounts for the gender gap in wages. You think about hours, for example, hours worked, and you think about some occupations are just structured to be part-time. So for example, most bank tellers in the United States are part-time workers. Most bank tellers are also women. So when you sort of say, well, I'm going to adjust for work hours, you're actually taking away a lot of the story about occupations simply by the fact that you're adjusting for work hours. But anyway, the broader point here is that segregation, of course, is very important for understanding all sorts of gaps, including the gender gap in wages. And what I want to do for the rest of the time here today is just to, again, give you a little bit of a sense of what some of the social science literature says about how employment practices can help us speed up those trends toward integration and maybe get it down from 330 years to maybe 250, because that would be much better for all of us. The answer here is the typical sociology answer, yes and no. what employment practices can do and have done enormous amounts to help reduce the extent to which employers are just looking at gender or race or other sorts of status groups, and basically hiring on the basis of that alone, right? So one of the things that modern employment practices do is they fight against that tendency to simply hire people who look exactly like you without any recourse whatsoever for doing that. So certainly modern employment practices have done and can do a lot to reduce integration. But what the crux of my talk here in the last bit of it is going to be about is really the fact that the devil is in the details. Right, so in a lot of the employment practices that we think about as being reducing discrimination, reducing segregation, reducing that gender gap in wages, it turns out to be a little bit more of a complicated story than, yes, these are always good things. So I'm going to give you some examples. I'm not attempting to give you a comprehensive overview of this literature by any means. I'm also not going to give you a comprehensive literature review on each of these practices. I mean, we'd be here for 330 years, we'd all be dead and bored. But I just want to highlight a few of these, and they're going to fall into kind of these 4 categories. I'm thinking about tools that people have used to try to increase the diversity of the applicant pool, right? So one of the arguments is that you have to have that diverse applicant pool in order to diversify the job that comes out and the workforce that comes out at the other end. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some hiring practices, a little bit about some of the research around parental leave and what parental leave can and can't do. And then finally talk a little bit about performance evaluations and merit-based promotions as being one of the tools that organizations have used to try to kind of organize their workforce and make sure that they're getting the best people in the jobs that need them. Most of these studies that I'm going to talk about come out of the private sector, a couple of them come out of academia. You can sort of judge for yourself whether this characterizes your agencies or not. But again, most of this research is done on the private sector. So, first of all, think about efforts to diversify the applicant pool. I happen to be a department chair. I get to write job ads. There is a statement that has to go in every single job ad that Cornell ever puts out, which is basically an equal opportunity employment statement. And the question is, what does this do? Does it actually increase the diversity of the applicant pool? And there's a really interesting study that just came out maybe a couple of weeks ago from a couple of economists at Chicago. Those of you who know Chicago economics can interpret accordingly. They tend to be fairly conservative, shall we say. A couple of economists coming out of Chicago did this really interesting study where they had 2,500 job seekers for an administrative assistant position. And what they did was they manipulated whether that ad for the administrative assistant position had that classic EEO statement. I mean, you've all seen them, I'm sure, hundreds and hundreds of times, basically saying that this organization encourages women and minorities to apply. I mean, it's a little bit fancier language than that, but you know what the statement says. And what they wanted to know was, well, is this actually increasing the diversity of the applicant pool? And the answer is no. And it's actually worse than no. What they found was that qualified non-white applicants who received that EEO statement were actually less likely to apply than qualified non-whites who didn't get that statement in the job ad that they saw. Right, so there was actually a decline of 6.4 percentage points in the likelihood that those qualified non-whites were going to actually apply for the position. And they did a little bit of a follow-up with these job seekers. They had a survey for the job seekers, and they tried to figure out, well, why? What could be going on here? And the answers seemed to be that the qualified non-whites saw that EEO statement, and they thought it meant that they were going to be a token. Right? So there's a real concern about tokenism, and they would actually interpret the very presence of this statement as being something that maybe was going to say something about how they were going to be treated in that organization going forward. Right? Again, I should point out that this is just one job title, administrative assistant. In some occupations, my own, for example, professor, it would be almost impossible to come up with a plausible experiment where you didn't have that statement in the job ad, because virtually every university puts that in all of their job ads, right? So again, you know, I don't want to generalize too much from this, but I do think it's kind of telling that here we have a very, very simple test of a classic tool for increasing the diversity of our applicant pool. And at least in this particular case, it doesn't seem to be working and may even be hurting a little bit. I'm going to move to a very classic study of hiring practices. This is for one particular occupation, the occupation of orchestra player, musician. And you may not know all that much about how players are chosen for an orchestra, but until the 1970s and 80s, most orchestras, professional orchestras, would just have people come out on stage and they would play and they would be assessed for how well they played. And they would either get the job or more likely they would not get the job because it was very, very competitive. What started to happen is more and more of these professional orchestras started putting the players behind a visible screen. Right? So they could not see the player at all. They could, of course, hear the player because that would be kind of the point, but they could not see the player. And the two economists, Claudia Goldman, who's incidentally the first female economist to be tenured at Harvard, and Cecilia Rouse did this very, very great study where they basically looked at the data from professional orchestras. They tried to see what the impact of this one change in hiring practice was. So when you start to put the players behind the screen, what happens? They found that a woman's chances of being hired was 1.6 times greater if that player was playing from behind that visible screen for at least some of the audition rounds. And they also estimated that about 25% of the increase in the representation of women in professional orchestras was actually due to that switch, that very, very simple switch in hiring practices to put the players behind the screen. And this study is often interpreted as a demonstration of discrimination that was occurring before the screen, but it's also, I think, an interesting and perhaps very unique way that you can think about solving one of these problems about implicit biases. Basically what was going on is that the people who were hearing the players and evaluating the players had implicit biases that women were just less good at playing violin or whatever it might be. You eliminate that visual cue, and you eliminate a good chunk of that discrimination. Now granted, probably not many of you are hiring violinists on a regular basis, and we can think of lots of occupations where this simply doesn't work. You need to see the personal interaction. But again, I do think it's kind of a neat little study about how you can think creatively, perhaps in your own organizations, in your own context, about how you can eliminate some of those visible cues in some of the early rounds, perhaps, of evaluating candidates. Another tool that we have in the post-civil rights era is basically suing companies, right? Having charges come up against companies because of their discriminatory practices, and then going through illegal proceedings and having some sort of settlement about that EEOC charge. This is some research. It's a little bit old at this point, maybe 10 years old, more or less. But it was looking at the impact of these charges and settlements against companies, against private employers who had these EEOC charges leveled against them. Basically, the question is, what did they do within their organizations afterwards in terms of increasing the representation of women and workers of color? Basically, again, fairly depressing news. The employers who had sex discrimination charges and sanctions against them actually showed no reduction in gender segregation in the subsequent years, right? So you look at what was going on in that organization before they had the EEOC charge against them, and then you look what happened after that EEOC charge and settlement, and you see if anything changed. The answer was basically no, right? Kind of sad, kind of depressing. But interestingly, these authors did find that other employers within that same industry actually did start to decrease segregation of their organizations after there was this very prominent charge and settlement of some other company within that same industry. You might think, well, why would that be, right? Why would the target actually not do anything, and then you have all these other employers in the same industry reacting to that? And the argument that Beth Hirsch came up with was essentially that often the companies that were getting these EEOC charges and settlements against them were very, very, very large companies, right, that had all these lawyers around. And basically, if they did get a fee, it was such a trivial part of their company's bottom line that they could just sort of ignore it. But the other employers often were the smaller employers who couldn't afford to have these charges leveled against them. So essentially what was going on is the smaller employers were learning and trying to avoid having what happened to the larger employers come after them as well. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about some of these studies on kind of in the realm of discrimination and hiring practices, I also wanted to talk a little bit about parental leave. Right? We think about parental leave as being one of the major tools by which we can increase women's participation fully in the workforce. Increasingly, we're thinking about it as a way that companies can actually kind of spin that cultural balance that says that women are the primary caregivers by basically creating incentives for men to do more of that child rearing within the home. So we're starting to, at least in some sectors of the economy, move away from maternity leave toward just parental leave that is not based on actually giving birth physically. So one of the lessons that we know that comes out of comparative research, basically looking across countries, mostly advanced industrialized countries, is that there's what's called a paradox of egalitarianism. And basically what this means, and what data after data, study after study show, is that the countries that have the most generous family leave policies, whether it's around parental leave, whether it's around job sharing, whether it's around other sorts of kind of tools to implement family-friendly work policies, those companies often have the most segregated workforces. Right? So this paradox of egalitarianism, that the very generous companies that are really trying to improve women's access often have the most segregation as well. Just as a little bit of a side, I had the great fortune of spending a semester in Florence, Italy a few years ago. And I was walking around Florence, Italy, and there was a work crew that was cleaning billboard, basically cleaning posters off of walls, right? You guys have walls here with posters in New York City, as it turns out. We don't have them in, we just have trees. But essentially, this work crew, there were 3 people on this work crew, and they were all dressed up in these, day-glow jumpsuits to prevent them from being hit by Vespas, which is a real problem in Italy. And 2 of them were men, and one of them was a woman. And what I loved about this is that the woman was dressed in this, horrible bright orange day-glow jumpsuit, but she had like the coolest heels. So I wish I had my cell phone and had the guts to actually take a picture of her shoes, but she was seriously wearing stiletto heels, cleaning the inside out. Anyway, the point here is that Italy actually has very, very low levels of gender segregation compared to many other countries, right? And we don't think about Italy as being a country that has a lot of gender egalitarianism. We think about it as being a very traditional, family-centered country. Again, this comes down to a question about who is actually in the workforce, right? So when you set up these very family-friendly workplaces, you tend to get a very, very different type of woman who is actually working than in countries where it's much more traditionally family-oriented, right? But anyway, my point here is that this is a paradox of egalitarianism, that parental leave can actually be associated with greater segregation. I also wanted to point out, this is a study by a colleague of mine, Malika Thomas at Cornell, who was doing some really interesting work looking at the impact of the 1993 Family Medical Leave Act. And basically what she shows is that Family Medical Leave Act did increase the likelihood that women would stay employed, right? They would stay employed and actually with their same employers, but they were much less likely to be promoted. Right? So yes, they were able to stay in the workforce, 5% more likely to stay in the workforce, but 8% less likely to be promoted, even if they themselves didn't have kids. Right? So you're taking childless women and you're actually reducing their chances of promotion after this Family Medical Leave Act. What was going on? Well, Malika's explanation is that the employers are investing less in those women of childbearing years because they simply don't know whether those women are then going to drop out of the labor force or go part-time, right? So the employers are reacting to a change in who is actually staying in the labor force. They're investing less in training those women of childbearing years. They're investing less in putting them in positions within the company that are going to be exceedingly high-impact positions, right? So again, the point here is that we have this tool, the Family Medical Leave Act, that was intended to do one thing. It turns out it may have actually hurt some women's chances because of the shift in employers' behavior afterwards. I actually love this photo. I think all of us have been there, right? If you have a kid, you had that like face smack. Anyway, this guy is actually trying to do an interview on television. He's getting whacked by his baby. The other issue about particularly the shift toward increasingly incorporating dads into parental leave is that ostensibly gender-neutral policies like parental leave may not have gender-neutral effects. Right, so here I'm going to draw on an example from academia, which I realize may be a little bit outside the realm of, well, anything normal, but nonetheless I'm going to talk about it. So in academia, you're an apprentice for roughly 6 years as an assistant professor. You then go up for review, a promotion to tenure, and it often comes with a promotion to a different associate professor status. But basically, everybody's given roughly 6 years on the clock, as it's called. And the goal is that during that 6 years, you have to amass a certain record of publication in your particular discipline, and you have to become widely known, and you have to become a great teacher, and so forth. And so this review at 6 or 7 years is extraordinarily important for your career, right? If you get tenure, you basically have job security for life, unless you do something terrible. If you don't get promoted, you have to leave the organization. You're basically fired. I mean, they give you a little bit of a lag time, a year to find another job, but it's a very, very consequential review. And one of the things that universities have done to try to level the playing field is to give 1 additional year on the clock if you have a baby, right? So essentially recognizing that those childbearing years tend to correspond to the years that you're an assistant professor, they give you an extra year on the clock if you had a kid. What happens, though, is that this supposedly gender-neutral family policy, so most universities will give that to both mothers and fathers. What has happened is that it's actually increased the chances that men get promoted in economics. This is where the study was done. 19 percentage point increase in the chances that male economists get promoted, 22% decrease in the chances that women economists get promoted, right? Economics is not a discipline where you can afford a 22% decline in the number of women who are at the higher levels. Let's just put it that way. And so again, the question is, well, what can possibly be going on? Why is it that this gender-neutral policy actually had a huge kind of step backwards in terms of gender inequality? Basically what's going on is that the men are using that extra year to go publish more, to go basically amass the record that they need to impress their bosses, as it were, to get promoted to the next level. The women are actually using it to take care of the kids. And so what you have is, because the men are using it to publish more, they're raising the bar for everybody else. Now, in order to get tenure, you can't just have 2 books, you have to have 3 books, because after all, the men can do it, so why can't everybody else? So again, gender-neutral policy, but very, very far from gender-neutral effects. And finally, what I wanted to talk about is this whole class of management tools, basically performance evaluation and merit-based promotions. I would say most corporations in the United States now do some version of this. Essentially, the idea is that you evaluate your employees regularly and you base promotions and raises on the outcome of those evaluations, right? Pretty straightforward. I'm sure you guys all do this in your day-to-day lives all the time. One of the arguments about these performance evaluations and merit-based promotions is that they level the playing field, right? They essentially take some of the subjective out and they take away that ability of employers to simply promote on the basis of who their friend is or who looks like them. And they actually embed it in some concrete metrics about how well people are doing on the job. The other argument, though, is that these performance evaluations and merit-based promotion systems are really a smokescreen. And the argument here is that you have these formal policies that basically give legitimacy to whatever it was that the managers wanted to do in the first place, right? So you can think about this, are these performance evaluation systems a great leveler, or is it really a smokescreen and there's some sort of a decoupling between the intent of the tool and how it actually works on the ground? So the big point here is that these performance evaluations themselves can actually reflect the gender stereotypes and double standards that exist out there in the broader society, right? Organizations don't exist in a vacuum, and the people who come into organizations didn't just sort of get born there. Oh, we might think that we live there, but we didn't get born there. So we're coming in with all these gender stereotypes and baggages and double standards, and that's just getting embedded within these performance evaluations. So this is a brand new study done by Shelley Carell with some colleagues out of Stanford University. And she actually has access to 200 performance reviews in a technology firm. It's a Fortune 500 technology firm that I'm not allowed to say what it is, but I'm sure we can all probably guess. Although Stanford University is maybe not, there's lots of technology firms around there, but so she had 200 plus performance reviews, and she actually had access to what the managers wrote about the employees and also the ultimate performance rating. This is on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 was high, right? So you want to be that employee who gets the 5. And what she found, first of all, is that for a lot of traits, there were really no gender differences, right? So men and women were getting described in this way pretty much at equal rates, and they had those being described with a particular set of adjectives had roughly the same chances of them getting a 5, which is where you want to be in order to get a promotion or a raise. But there were some gender differences in these performance reviews that really are indicative of some of the stereotypes that are out there about men and women's competencies, and also some of the double standards that get imposed on men and women within organizations about what it takes to get ahead. So for example, I've shown you a graph here of just one of these traits. This is taking charge. So first of all, the male employees were much more likely to be described as taking charge. And it was much, if you were described by your manager as being a take charge type of person, you were much more likely to get a 5 performance rating if you were a man, but not if you were a woman. So the women who were described as taking charge were not necessarily getting those 5 performance ratings. In fact, they tended to be more likely to get the 4 or below performance ratings. How about helpful? Well, helpful and all sorts of adjectives that are similar to helpful were much, much more likely to be used to describe women, but it didn't help them. Being helpful in your organization is not necessarily a way to a good performance evaluation. You want to be unhelpful, I guess. I don't know. I try that with my students and it never seems to really work. But anyway, so this trait of being helpful, right? This is a stereotypically female trait. But in this case, it was not helping those women get ahead within their organizations. And finally, if your manager described you as advocating for yourself, right, being somebody who says, well, I think I really deserve a promotion because of X, it's huge gender defects. So the men who were self-advocates were about 33% more likely to get a 5 than other men. The women who were self-advocates were 16% less likely to get a 5 than other women. So basically what's going on is that we have this cultural value system that we reward men who are out there speaking for themselves and advocating for themselves. But for women, it's not at all clear whether that's a good trait or a bad trait. Okay, equal performance evaluations does not guarantee equal chances. So this is another study. I'm just going to go through this very quickly because I'm almost out of time. Basically looking at personnel records from a large service organization. What they found was that men were more likely to receive a raise and promotion recommendation than women in the same job with the same supervisor and the same performance evaluation, right? So even if we take out the gender biases that might be built into the performance evaluation themselves, just getting a 5 or the top rank doesn't necessarily mean that you have equal chances to get that raise or that promotion. Interestingly, there was also a paradox of meritocracy within these organizations. Basically, that managers in organizations that emphasize meritocracy in their mission statements actually showed greater bias in favor of men. Right? So in some sense, this statement of being an organization that believed in meritocracy, that believed in equal opportunity, that really was very proud of its performance evaluation system, that took out all that noise and all that subjective assessments, turns out that the managers there were actually more likely to promote their men than their women in organizations that didn't make such a big noise and stink about being meritocratic. So the takeaway message here for all of this, this came up actually in Don's talk. We attempted to coordinate here. The devil is in the details, right? So I don't want you to go away from this talk thinking that I'm against modern employment practices and that we all just went back to like hiring our nephew, then everything would be hunky-dory. That's not at all the message, right? Employment practices can do a lot to reduce gender segregation. The managers are key, right? The managers are on the front lines, but they have to have buy-in, they have to have transparency, we have to have accountability on the part of the managers, as Don alluded to. All right, so that's one of the details. But the other detail that I want you to take away from this is that some of these tools can have unanticipated consequences, right? That even though they may do a lot to reduce gender segregation, in some cases they're either ineffective or they might actually be counterproductive given even the best intentions of whoever it was that devised them. So that's where I want to end, and I'm happy to take questions. I actually want to come back to Cornell here in a second if there's time. Yeah.
The microphone. You mentioned earlier. You mentioned the orchestra hiring earlier.
I'm sorry?
The orchestra hiring earlier.
Yeah.
You mentioned the orchestra hiring earlier. You said that they limited visual cues and that I think you said 90% are hiring more women. But I'm wondering, in terms of using blind resumes, meaning taking resumes and removing pedigree information like name, where people went to school, things like that, whether that is a good way to remove implicit bias, and do you think that's the best practice for organizations or agencies who want to address diversity in all these issues?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think that's right. So a lot of the research coming out of the social sciences is based on these audit studies, basically where you send the same resume, but you vary whether it's a male or female name, or you vary whether it's a stereotypically black versus stereotypically white name, and so forth. All those studies show that there's a penalty, right? So even an identical resume getting sent to the same types of managers, I mean, it's not necessarily exactly the same person, there is a penalty for being identified as female. In particular, if you have anything on your resume that says that you might be a mother, take it off. I mean, come on, folks. Seriously, you don't want to admit to being part of the PTA, right? Because that's going to reduce your chances of being hired by a company. So I think that the lesson here from that, if you spin that around, is that de-identifying, at least in some of the early rounds, could do a lot to help increase the diversity of the applicant pool. And I think in the era of digital resumes and so forth, that becomes a lot more possible than it was in the 14th century when I was first applying for jobs and you sent out paper. Papyrus actually.
Hi. Thanks for taking my question. So I'm going to ask the same question I asked Dr. Childers.
Yeah.
So pretty much at our agency right now, we've had challenges in the sense that there is a greater percentage of female managers, irrespective of ethnicity, versus men. And one of our goals as we try to focus on diversity recruitment is to try to increase access to these career opportunities for men as well by creating internal mentorship programs. Do you have any guidance on how we can get buy-in from hiring managers to consider, create opportunities for internally for these to promote men internally?
Yeah. So that's an interesting case, and this is actually, I'm going to tell my Cornell story because it's related sort of vaguely at the end of this. But I think that some of the same tools that we use and we think about as ways to increase the representation of women and workers of color could certainly be used to try to increase the representation of men, assuming that they are policies that are really trying to focus in on skills and the other things that we think are very relevant to the job, right? So there's nothing, there's no reason to think that we need a whole different set of tools to increase the representation of men in an organization where men are underrepresented as we would for women, if that made any sense. The comment about Cornell I wanted to make, so this came up with Ruth Bader Ginsburg earlier. Cornell, as you may know, is partly a private school and partly a public school. It's kind of this weird schizophrenic organization, as I like to call it. The veterinary medicine college is part of the public side. So for a long, long time, it was in the charter for Cornell University that they would admit, get this, now listen carefully, they would admit 60 students each year into the veterinary medicine program and 2 women. So notice mutually exclusive categories, right? 60 students and 2 women were admitted every year into the Cornell Veterinary Medicine program. This lasted actually until I think it was around the mid-70s when they finally got rid of that incredibly sexist language, the assumption that women couldn't be students too. And now, Cornell Veterinary Medicine is at the point where 98% of their applicants are women. And the faculty there are very, very concerned about basically some sort of affirmative action for male students within veterinary medicine. Now, part of it is the shift in vets in general, right, and what it is that they're doing. Even in upstate New York, there aren't nearly as many cows as there once were. We have quite a few, but not nearly as many. So, you know, it's changed from basically large animal practice to small animal practice, with some horses thrown in the side. We all know the affinity between teenage girls and horses. But basically, what they're concerned about within this organization is that they know that once occupation becomes, it sort of tips over to being female-dominated, you tend to get a decline in wages, a decline in prestige, a decline in status that's associated with that, right? So this is a very interesting case of an occupation that has almost completely flipped from being male-dominated to female-dominated. And we might think about, well, what can the veterinary school actually do to try to make this occupation something where men feel like they have equal access to it as well?
Thanks, and I just have one more.
Yeah.
So we're trying to focus on diversity recruitment within our agencies. Another thing that we're trying to do to widen that is we also try to partner with non-Ivy League schools, like trying to partner with CUNY School of Public Health.
Yep.
You know, and it's hard to convince the hiring managers. If we send a resume from CUNY versus Columbia or Johns Hopkins or Harvard, they're more inclined to go with the Ivy League, even though it's the same accrediting body, accrediting an MPH program, irrespective of whether it's Ivy League or not. They just have this preconceived, stereotypical, you know, perception that somebody from Columbia or Harvard could do a better job as a research scientist versus someone from CUNY. So that's a challenge. How do we try to convince the hiring managers to be more open-minded? It's really difficult.
Well, first of all hiring managers should be hiring students from Cornell. I had to say that. So I was supposed to give you time to come up with a better answer, and it actually didn't work very well. I think you're absolutely right. So there is this classism, I'm going to call it, because that's what it is. And we see it in all sorts of agencies. It's terrible on Wall Street, right? Well, yeah, you can only go to Yale, right? So, I mean, it is I'm just going to affirm that it is a very real problem. In terms of how you get managers to buy into this, my initial reaction, again, this is the social scientist reaction, is that you really show them the data. And I bet you could find that somebody who has an MBA from a SUNY school does just as well as somebody who has an MBA from a more elite institution. I mean, I think that it's going to be a lot of hard work because you're basically fighting against these classist biases that people have. And there's also, you know, we all tend to maybe have cultural affinities with people who are like us. And when you have a group of managers who all went to these elite MBA programs, they're going to think that, you know, this other person fits better. Well, what does fit mean? Well, fit means that they play golf like I do, right? Which in my case is badly, but. So, you know, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it's something that we need to figure out how to fight against. I would say go to the data, but I think that, again, there are always going to be people who aren't really persuaded by data. So, and it's a slog. It's a slog, yeah. Good, thank you.
Very good. We're going to break for a very short period, just 5 minutes, so in the aid of catching up on some time.